All right. Good morning, everyone. It is that time. It's 9:45. So, kids, have you found your Sunday school classes? Make sure you find your class, and you guys can head off to Sunday school with your teachers. Bye, guys. We got 3rd, 4th, 5th grade over here. Miss Julie. I think they just went that way. Yeah, sorry. Everyone know where they're going? All right. Well, welcome back, everyone. Come on in and grab a seat once you get your refreshments. I'm Pastor Lindsay. I'm the associate pastor for adult discipleship. I think I know everybody in this room right now, but I've been gone, so you never know. I've been on family leave, and it's good to be back with everyone. If you are looking for Start Here, I know Mara's going to Start Here. If anyone's looking for the new members class, it's that away. Hey. All right. So I just want to make a quick announcement at the start of this class. This is our last installment in our 3-part series with Miriam. And so next week begins a new class, and that's going to be taught by our stewardship team. They're going to be kind of helping us think about what it means to be a generous people. We often kind of talk about things along this theme during the season of sort of stewardship, season of giving that leads up to our Dedication Sunday, where we invite our congregation to make their financial commitments to APC for the year ahead. So that is what's coming next week and for kind of the month of November. And so I want to just make sure I hand out the attendance sheet for this class this week, just in case there's sort of follow-ups, things that people would like to ask Miriam for, or things that Miriam might want to disseminate. So I'll just pass this around so that we can record it there. And I'm going to hand it off to Allison.
Good morning. So good to see you all again. So I'm Allison Young. I realized I'd never introduced myself, and some of you might not know me. Many people may not know me. I'm one of the team members for the Mental Health Matters ministry here, and I just want to start by highlighting the things that Mental Health Matters is offering. First of all, Miriam's class. Thank you so much for being here, making the drive from Pennington these 3 Sundays. We still have books. Feel free to borrow and return at some point, or if you want to own it, it's $15. Anytime you can turn that money in, you don't have to have it today. I do have change. If you have a 20, I can give you change. But it's such a wonderful book. We also have ongoing a divorce support group for women. So Marla Golden is leading that. If you're interested or know somebody who might be interested, please get in touch with Marla. We're starting another support group for parents with teen or young adult children who are struggling with mental health issues. I know that in that situation, parents often feel so alone and taken by surprise and don't know what to do, how to be. So this support group is to help in that situation. They'll be meeting with a therapist once a month who will give a lot of guidance to the group. It's not that he will be delivering therapy, but education about what kind of things you can do as a parent in that situation. And then the group will meet 2 more times in the month with a peer-led environment. And I'm going to be teaching one of the practices from Sacred Balance that's especially applicable to parents in that kind of situation. So that's beginning November 2nd. And then finally, we've established a counseling fund. People who are faced with needing mental health support from a therapist and find it difficult to afford it. So we have a counseling fund, which we're able to do because of a grant we received from the Coastlands Presbytery. So, thank you, Miriam. I'm going to turn it over to Miriam. We're so grateful that you've come. Thank you.
Thank you, Allison. And thank you, Allison, for inviting me, for connecting me with this wonderful congregation. It has been such a joy to be here. And I was just saying, it's starting to feel like home. You know, I've been coming every week. I'm like, oh, this is really nice. So it's nice. I appreciate you all welcoming me into this community for the past few weeks and your excitement about the book and about spiritual practices and using these things in our lives to help with our mental health journeys, but also with deepening our faith and our spirituality. It's always fun to connect with other people who are also on that same path. So just again, a little bit of a recap for anybody who may have missed a week or two. The first week of this 3-week series, I focused on practices that help us become more aware of God's presence. The 2 practices I talked about were centering prayer and practicing the presence of God. And they were both focused on this sort of intentionality and just awareness, paying attention to the fact that God is with us throughout our day. And then last week, we shifted into how do we respond to that? When we start becoming more aware of God's presence in our lives, what do we do about it? And so there were 2 practices, the daily examine, which is a sort of a daily review of what's going on in your life, where is God at work, what's bringing you closer to God, what's pulling you further away from God. And then also this practice that I've coined as prayerful savoring. It's essentially a gratitude practice, but an active enjoyment of our senses with awareness of the fact that God has given us these moments of joy in our lives. So we've become more aware of God. We've figured out how we might want to respond to God's presence. What comes next? Well, part of our faith, part of our spiritual journey is always turning us outward, right? We have the story of Abraham and God saying, I'm going to bless you so that you may be a blessing to others. And that is always the direction that our faith brings us. As we become more aware of God's presence, as we figure out where God is calling us in our own lives, we are turned outwards to others to see how we can be a part of the community that God has created. So that's the focus that we're going to be looking at with these 2 practices this week. Recognizing these connections between God, ourselves, and then the world around us, the people around us. And kind of extending our comfort zones. You know, we tend to live in our comfortable bubbles of what we're used to, our routines every day, and there's nothing wrong with that. But what is it like to step out of that routine, to extend our awareness of God? And then this act of engaging both our hearts, but also our physical bodies in doing God's work in the world. So we are aligning our thoughts and our hearts with God's love for the world, for the people around us, and then taking active steps, moving our bodies in ways that live out God's work in the world. So the 2 practices that I'm going to talk about today, the first one is called loving kindness prayer. And this is about preparing our hearts. This is a structured prayer in which we are offering blessings, starting with ourselves, with God's love for us, and then working in expanding circles to offer that same blessing of God's love and peace, first to people we care about, then to people maybe that we feel a little neutral, we don't know them super well, and then to people that we find difficult. And then finally, the widest circle is all people in the world. Can we offer God's love to all people? And this is rooted in Jesus' commandment to love our enemies. It's one of the most difficult teachings in Scripture, is how do we actually love our enemies? What does that look like? How do we get into a state of mind and a state of our heart where we can actually offer kindness to others? The way that I have described this in the book is that we first tap into the love that God offers us and use that love to strengthen our capacity to love others. So the idea is that we cannot love our enemies until we are experiencing God's love for us. We love because God first loved us. And so that is the format and the structure of this prayer. And then the practice of pilgrimage. This is a well-known practice in Christian tradition that we associate with travel, right? A pilgrimage is a journey to a place. And this is kind of a re-envisioning of the idea of pilgrimage, focusing on the idea of activation, which is a mental health term for getting ourselves moving. And I'll talk a little bit about that when we get into some of the mental health benefits. But the idea is that for people who experience depression, there is often like a physical slowing down, a difficulty moving, and one of the treatments for that is called behavior activation. It's getting yourself up and making yourself move even when you don't want to. And so what does that look like in our spiritual lives? When we feel kind of stuck, when we feel slowed down, how do we get ourselves active? And often that means stepping outside of our routines. That means trying something new, going to a new place, experiencing something. And I have linked this idea of activation also to the idea of activism. What does it look like to act out our faith in the world? What does it look like to put our faith into motion? And there's a lot of tradition in the Christian tradition and particularly in African American spirituality here in the US about praying with our feet. It's a familiar quote that I think, as best I could track it down, goes back to Frederick Douglass, but it's the idea that we don't just send prayers to those people over there who are suffering, we go to them. We pray with our feet, and it's used in a lot of protest marches, activism. The civil rights movement picked up on this term. It's been used in the Black Lives Matter movement, so it's been around for a while. But what does it mean to actually move our bodies in a way that is linked to God's will in the world? So any form of movement that brings us to a new vantage point and can help expand our awareness of God's presence in the world. So pilgrimage is linking movement to a sacred goal. We are seeking something holy, and we are moving our bodies and ourselves in a way that's going to bring us towards that holy thing in some way. So the theme of these two practices is that experiencing God always points us outwards, towards compassion for others, and this invitation to join in the work that God's Spirit is already doing in the world. And that is the natural progress of our spiritual journey, as we start with awareness of God and relationship with God, and we respond to that, and then we are called out into the world. So the loving kindness prayer is based in Jesus' teachings about love. There are a lot of great scripture verses where Jesus has direct commandments about love, right? What are the greatest commandments? Jesus says, love God and love your neighbor as yourself. So right there in those two commandments, we have loving God, we have loving ourselves, and we have loving our neighbors. And they're all linked together as our greatest commandment, our greatest calling from God. We have Jesus' teachings about the Good Samaritan, right? Kind of changing, when we say love our neighbor, who is that neighbor? And Jesus is very clear that that neighbor isn't just the people we're used to, right? It's the people that we may feel uncomfortable with. And then he even directly says in the Sermon on the Mount, love your enemies, right? It's one of the most unique teachings in the Christian tradition. It's not just treat people the way they treat you and love the people who are part of your circle. It's no, you have to love the people who have not been kind to you. And that's really hard to do. And I will talk later about how we do that in a way that is safe for us, right? That loving our enemies doesn't mean being a doormat and letting people, take over. So from a mental health standpoint and a trauma-informed standpoint, how can we offer love to people in a way that still respects our own integrity and our own self-respect. And then we have these early Christian martyrs, the early followers of Jesus who were working in a Roman Empire that was actively persecuting them. And a lot of them were known for saying prayers as they were being killed, as they were being persecuted, praying for their enemies. And they modeled those prayers on the words that Jesus said on the cross, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing." And so we see that link of Jesus' teachings about loving enemies and how that connects into actual work in the world and dealing with really difficult situations in our lives. And then we have these nonviolent resistance movements. We think especially of Martin Luther King Jr. He wrote a book, a well-known, wonderful book I highly recommend called The Strength to Love. And he talks about what it was like as a black man to try to love white racists. And he has a lot of powerful words there, but it's this idea that transformation doesn't come through hate. Transformation always comes through love, and so that nonviolent movement. Similarly, Desmond Tutu and the Truth and Reconciliation Committee in South Africa and the work that they did after apartheid to try to move forward using love and forgiveness rather than judgment and punishment. So the structure, the format of this prayer is actually drawn from a Buddhist meditation. There's a meditation called the metta meditation or loving kindness meditation. You may be familiar with it if you've done any work with meditation traditions. I've seen it used in various ways in yoga classes. It's a more well-known tradition. But the difference when we practice it as a Christian practice is that it's not just a general love and compassion. It is directly tied to the love that God offers us in Jesus Christ. That we start there, that God loves us first. 1 John 4:19 specifies we love because God first loved us. And so if it is a practice of our faith, it has to be rooted in God's love for us. And that, to me, gives strength to this practice, because there are days when I don't feel like I've got it in me to love other people, not even people around me, right? Not even the people I usually am pretty good at loving. Like, I'm done, I'm tired. But where do I draw strength in those moments? It's not from some abstract idea of compassion. It's from the fact that I was loved, right? That I have experienced God's love directly to me, and God's love to me through people in my life who have loved me. And I draw on that to build up a reserve of love that I can use to share with others. And this verse from Matthew is the praying for your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. And then we have pilgrimage. Pilgrimage, as I shared, is this idea of a journey, and we have so many wonderful narratives in Scripture about journeys, right? Abraham and Sarah being called out of their home and journeying to a new land. The Exodus, right? People leaving this oppression and being on a journey towards freedom. And then in the New Testament, even Jesus, journeys all around, right? We read about Jesus moving from one town to another to live out this calling that he had to heal and to share God's love. And we have Paul's journeys, right? The missionary journeys, the beginning of the spread of our faith came through people leaving the comfort of their hometown and their home communities and going and sharing God's love, God's good news out into other places in the world. And again, the early Christian tradition picked up on that, and they continued this tradition of pilgrimage. There are pilgrimage paths that are still used today that date back to the Middle Ages. If you've heard of the Camino de Santiago in Spain, I have friends and relatives who have recently just hiked the Camino. It's still an active pilgrimage path, but it began as a pilgrimage to a sacred site, a specific path that's journeyed to a holy site in hopes of some sort of spiritual connection, spiritual transformation. People who travel to the Holy Land, right, take pilgrimage to see the physical place where Jesus walked. And then we can engage with the very difficult history and current events that are going on there too, right? So there's this justice component when we think about what it's like to go to the physical space where Jesus walked, and how is that sacred space being used, being fought over today. And in the Middle Ages, when pilgrimage was a common thing and it was highly valued to either go to the Holy Land or go to these sacred sites, there were also people who couldn't travel, either financially couldn't afford it or had physical limitations, weren't able to. And so in many of the medieval cathedrals, they built labyrinths. And a labyrinth looks like a maze. It's actually basically the cover of my book is a picture of a labyrinth, right? It's this circling path, but there's only one path. It's not like a maze that's trying to trick you. It's meant to be a representation of a pilgrimage journey where you travel this wandering path towards a center, a place of connection with God, and then that you leave that place and travel back outwards, back into your life. And so the history of the labyrinth was tied to this idea of pilgrimage and a representative way to travel when you're not actually physically able to go. And so we have this idea already that pilgrimage doesn't necessarily need to be a physical journey. And that gets picked up on in the symbolic use of pilgrimage throughout Christian faith. If you're familiar with Pilgrim's Progress, John Bunyan's famous story, it's this allegory, this symbolic journey that's meant to represent the journey of faith, the story of our lives and the way that we struggle and move closer to God throughout the journey of our life. And there's many other ways that that language of pilgrimage gets used symbolically to represent our faith journey and our desire to connect more closely with God in our lives. A couple examples of that, the Catholic worker movement, which was a Catholic social justice movement early in the 20th century, mid-20th century. Dorothy Day was one of the leaders of that movement, and she had a journal that was titled On Pilgrimage. She was a person who lived and worked in some of the poorer areas and wrote a journal about her experience. And she used that metaphor of pilgrimage to talk about what it was like day to day to do the work of justice in the world. And the civil rights movement I mentioned several times already, using this language of pilgrimage, drawing on the traditions of the exile and Exodus narratives about moving towards freedom. So this pilgrimage image as a, as a metaphor for our struggles towards a more holy experience in the world. And the verse that I selected for that one from Isaiah, I am about to do a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? I will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert. So God's promise to change the world, to make new paths, and this imagery of a journey, of a wilderness experience that we're traveling through. So the loving kindness prayer helps shift our attitudes, our internal experience, and pilgrimage shifts our actions, our external way of being in the world. But they both move us from this sort of self-focus of our faith towards compassion and care for others. So what are some of the benefits of these practices? Decreasing painful emotions. So there's a lot of studies about compassion and about showing compassion both to ourselves but also to others as a way to move out of some of the cycles of rumination, depression, anger, those thoughts that get stuck in our head that we kind of cycle through that can cause more and more discomfort and more painful emotions in our lives. And that letting go of our judgments, both our judgments of ourselves and our self-criticism, but also our judgments of others, when we can release those and come from an attitude of compassion, it allows us to step out of that rumination. It allows us to shift towards more pleasant experiences in our lives. Not to say that they're going to fix and get rid of all the negative emotions, but it can keep us from dwelling in them, from making them bigger. Curiosity and openness. So when we start to connect with others and recognize our commonality with people, we start to get curious, right? Oh, I wonder what that person's life is like, right? When we're, doing a loving kindness meditation and we're thinking about somebody we don't know very well and wishing them well, we start to wonder, what do they want in their life, right? What are their goals? And it increases that curiosity about the world. And it's also related to the seeking out of new places and new experiences, right? This idea of pilgrimage as a way to get out of our everyday experience and try something new. So opening ourselves up to new experiences can shift our perspective. And it can also connect to this idea of connection with others, right? We've talked about already the way that connection with others is beneficial for our overall well-being, right? Knowing that we're a part of something bigger, that other people go through similar things that we do. And so these practices of compassion, as well as pilgrimage, when you go to a new place and meet someone new and realize, wow, they went through something really similar to me, or they're struggling in the same way that I am, right? There's this sense of connection that just shifts our perspective. It keeps us out of our own heads and helps us recognize that we're a part of something bigger. And it also reminds us of who we are. When we are grounded in God's love, we are always connected to that source, right? When we start our practices of compassion and our practices of pilgrimage or justice, rooted in our identity as beloved children of God, it gives us that grounding. It gives us that strength to do the work that we are called to do. And there's also the value of integration. We are connecting our physical body, our emotional experience, and our spiritual journey all into one. And so we feel that sense of contentment, of integration, of knowing that we are headed in the right direction and that we're moving in the way that God's Spirit is working. And we're moving from compassion, that internal experience, to action, right? The satisfaction that comes when we know that we're walking the talk, right? We're living out our faith and our everyday actions are aligning with what God is calling us to do. There's an enhancement of creativity. This is where some of the brain research comes in. They have found that breaking out of old routines, just the simple act of taking a different route to work or going to a place you've never been before, lights up the part of your brain that's connected to creativity and the forming of new neural connections, right? Creativity is about, putting things together in new ways or thinking of new ways to express something. And so having new input helps our brain be better at making new connections and can enhance our creativity. And creativity then is also linked to well-being, right? That the experience that we have when we are creating something, that sense of flow that sometimes happens if you're an artist or a writer, where you get into a state of creativity. And from a spiritual standpoint, right, we know that we are created in the image of God, and God is a creator. God is creative by nature, and so part of the image of God in us is that creative ability. And so these practices can help us tap into that, recognizing God created this wonderful world, I can have new experiences, I can be creative as well. And then broadening our perspective is always valuable. Seeing the bigger picture of the world. We talked about this, I think, in the first week when we were just talking about practicing the presence of God, about noticing God in the world gives us a new perspective on the things that we see every day. And that is even more so when we step out of our usual routines, when we go somewhere new and experience a part of the world or a perspective on the world that maybe we haven't seen before or haven't thought of before. And that helps us get more of that bigger picture of what God is doing in the world. Experiencing God at work in new places, in new ways, kind of stepping outside of our limited view of the world. And I mentioned this idea of behavior activation, right? That when somebody is experiencing depression, it's naturally very inward focused. There's ruminating thoughts that come along with depression. There tends to be an isolating, a disconnecting from others, and a slowing down, right? A feeling tired, feeling heavy. And so these practices are the opposite of that, right? Behavior activation, spiritual activation, getting ourselves going, connecting with others intentionally, right? Reminding ourselves that we're not isolated. And then physically moving our bodies in some way. We know there's all sorts of research out there about the benefits of exercise, right? I'm not going to get into that, pros and cons and all of that, right? But there is something about moving our bodies, right? When I noticed it a couple weeks ago when I was sick, my family had a cold virus run through the whole family, and it was a pretty rough one, and I spent one day completely in bed. And the next day I got up, and I was feeling a little better, but I just felt kind of glunky and heavy. And I went out, and I went for a short walk around my neighborhood. And just the fresh air, just the movement of my body kind of shifted me out of that heavy, glunky, I've been in bed all day, gross feeling, to be like, okay, now I can think about what else needs to happen for my day today. And so pilgrimage is a spiritual practice of that activation, of getting ourselves moving, that can kind of pull us out of our internal focus and bring us out into the world in some way. So when I talk about pilgrimage, sometimes I just talk about taking a walk or a roll or a ride around your neighborhood. Sometimes I talk about using a labyrinth. They make little finger labyrinths. I don't know if I have my sticker with me. I think it's on my laptop. But it's like a little tiny labyrinth that you can trace with your finger. So you don't have to go and travel to experience something new. Sometimes it can be a walk. Sometimes it can be going to a place that you've never been with the intention of seeking God in that place. What could God tell me about being with this group of people I've never been with before, right? Sometimes it might be an act of justice, right? I'm going to go and volunteer with this organization as an act of pilgrimage because it takes me out of my comfort zone and puts me around people whose life experience is really different than mine when I volunteer with them. And how does that become a sacred goal that I am journeying towards? So when I talk about pilgrimage, it's not just that idea of traveling to a faraway place. It's about moving ourselves towards something holy, whatever that may be. So it's a very flexible practice. And it has so many benefits for our mind, for our body, and for our spirit. But I do want to spend some time today with the loving kindness practice, the first practice that I talked about. But before I get into leading that practice, I want to open it up if there are any thoughts, any questions, anything you want to share with the group today.
Challenges, but I also see it as preventative medicine. And if we spend the time more on the preventative medicine, as we've learned in other fields, the less likely, not that it erases it, but allows us to have tools and practices that kind of muscle memories.
Absolutely. And I'll share, when we get into the loving kindness practice, I'm going to share a little bit about how I have used that as a preventative tool for difficult situations. Absolutely. Any other thoughts or questions about this idea of moving outwards in our spiritual practices?
I haven't been here. This is my first week here, and everything is making sense to me. So, yeah, I have been wanting to. I'm currently unemployed, so I think this is a good time for me to start this getting out of myself. Practice. Yeah.
Yeah, recognizing what time you're at. I spoke earlier about the book
As a whole has 9 different spiritual practices, and they're each going to be useful at different times in your life, right? When you're at this time of things changing, trying to figure out where we're going next, right? What does it look like to get outside of myself, to have some new experiences, and is that going to shift my perspective in a way, right? I would also highly recommend the daily examine that I did last week is also a great practice for discernment in times of change and just being more aware of how God is working through different things in our lives.
share with the group. They actually do a labyrinth at Rock. And so the kids have experienced it, but Lillian often invites the parents in, and it's extremely powerful. If anyone was interested, I could always talk to Maureen about bringing it out for our group here, but it is very, very powerful time.
Oh, that's so good to hear. There are outdoor labyrinths in the area too. I'm more familiar with like Pennington, Ewing area. There is a little school called Villa Victoria that has a labyrinth in their backyard that you can access off the DNR towpath. So you can just go for a walk and then walk the labyrinth and then come back, which I think is lovely. And there are churches in the area that have labyrinths as well, but you can get these portable labyrinths that you can just lay out on the floor and actually experience that. It's so great. I love hearing that it's being used with youth, especially, that giving kids, I mean, Allison talked earlier about the difficulty of mental health challenges with youth and how important it is to give our kids tools, right? Not just abstract knowledge of the Bible, but tools for how to manage their lives and how God relates to that. So I think that's wonderful. Thank you.
If you get a book, you'll have the labyrinth on the cover.
Thank you for that plug, Allison. Appreciate it. But there was another hand.
Yeah, It's in alignment with what you're speaking of, the support group that I have previously been involved with. The whole thought of move a muscle, change a thought is completely in alignment with what you're speaking of.
Yeah, and all the research, the contemporary research in mental health is about physical experience.
They call it somatic therapies, right? The way that our life experiences, whether it's trauma or just different memories, are embedded not just in our brains, but in our bodies and in our nervous system. And so what are some practices that can actually engage our physicality and shift that in a way that then has an impact on our thoughts and on our well-being and our emotions?
I'll share one thing that might be useful or might be ridiculous. Sometimes before I go to bed, I've got YouTube on just to I watch this dancing video. And sometimes I get up and just do the dance with them until I'm a little exhausted and I go to bed. And I feel good.
I love that. I think that's amazing. And I would call that a spiritual practice, right? Like dancing with God. Like, let's do it. Bring it on, right? Move our bodies in a way that expresses gratitude, that helps us. Put on the video right up here and we'll all just dance. Yeah. Well, there's some, in the world of like trauma research, they talk a lot of it. I'm going to get into it at my Faith and Science talk. I'll put that plug in right here. Next Sunday, November 2nd, 3:30 at Pennington Presbyterian Church. There are flyers over there. I'm giving a talk on the brain research related to some of these practices and to mental well-being and spirituality. It is going to be live streamed, so there's a link on the flyer if you want to just watch from home. But one of the things I'm going to be talking about is something called polyvagal theory, which is one of the contemporary theories about trauma and how trauma lives in our bodies. And they talk a lot about the need for regulating our nervous system. And they talk about things like dance and music and doing it in community so that our nervous system is responding. You may have heard of the idea of mirror neurons, right? The way that our parts of our brain automatically imitate people around us. It's a lot with children and development, but it's also with safety and calming down after traumatic experiences. Has to do with co-regulating with others. So dancing with other people is one of the best things you can do for your brain. And can we do more of that in church? How fun would that be? You know, I'm Presbyterian too, we're the frozen chosen, I know, but can we get our bodies moving? Singing together. The vibrations of music are one of the most calming things for our nervous system. So this activation, this doing things that may sound a little silly when we admit them, you know, in front of our church friends, but like they can be a spiritual practice when we relate them to God, when we invite God into that healing process with us. How powerful is that? How much can we integrate our physical healing, our mental healing, and our spiritual growth? And how much better off we'll all be if we can start to integrate those more.
I saw that last weekend at our men's retreat, and Rob encouraged me to be organized and taught guys pickleball. And, you know, 12 or 13 guys went and played for a few hours. It was really, well, initially I just wanted to do nothing for a couple hours. It was much more stimulating spiritually for the weekend to do that. And another group went biking together, and so a community of exercise and movement.
Yeah.
Shine last weekend.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's very powerful. Any last thoughts, questions before we practice together a little bit? So I shared that I was going to tell the story about how I use this loving kindness prayer. And I'll just put up the steps so you can see where we're going. We all have difficult people in our lives that we have to interact with. For me, it's certain family members sometimes that I have to go see a couple times a year, and I find them very challenging. And I learned this practice. I learned the Buddhist version of it, and I was like, you know, that really makes sense with everything I was taught about loving enemies, right? Like, and I just love that it gives me a structure for how to do that. And so on the advice of a very good therapist, I started practicing this loving kindness prayer in preparation for family events where I had to go and see some of these difficult family members. And so for a week or so leading up to the family event, I would spend time going through this prayer, feeling love for myself, all the steps, but focusing on the difficult person for step 4. And I was so amazed by how different my experience was of those family events. when I came to the event with an awareness of God's love for that difficult person, and having spent time praying for them and wishing them well, and remembering our commonalities, that even if I find them very difficult or they've done things that I find hurtful, there are things that we have in common. And one of those things is that we are created by God and that God loves us. And if I can tap into that, I don't come into that experience with such tension and such expectation of conflict. I'm more open to the ways that we can connect. And it just smooths over some of those difficulties. So I offer that as a real life personal example of the value of this prayer. But I also want to give a little warning that if it's the first time you're practicing this prayer, you may not want to pick somebody who has really deeply hurt you. It's like when you go to the gym. You don't pick up the 100-pound weight on your first day, right? That can be re-traumatizing if you haven't done the work to kind of work through your own suffering. And so I always say, if at any point in this prayer you are struggling or something feels unsafe or uncomfortable, go back to step 1. Feel God's love for you, because that is the core of this prayer, and none of the rest of it's going to work until you have that experience. So for step 4, if this is your first time practicing, pick someone a little irritating, but maybe not like the person who's hurt you the most, right? Right? You know, the coworker that just kind of gets on your nerves, or the family member who you love, but like, yeah, I have to see them again, right? But maybe not the person who like has really deeply hurt you for today. And you can work your way up to that. And it can be a very healing practice when you're able to, but it's not, especially in a group setting like this, it's probably not where you want to start for this. So the prayer on the right-hand side there, may they feel God's love, may they feel God's peace, may they feel God's joy. That's the whole prayer, but we're repeating it in these steps. So we're going to repeat it 3 times for each step of the process. So for the first step, it's going to be, may I feel, right? And then we're going to, and you can see I bracketed the they, insert the name of the person, if you know it. Often for step 3, I pick someone who I may not even know their name, like, you know, the mail delivery carrier who brings me my mail every day. I'm just kind of curious about what their life is like, right? Or the grocery store clerk who you go in the same checkout line every time and you say hi, but you don't actually really know them that well, right? So that you may not know the name, but if you know the person's name, it can be very powerful to insert the person's name as you repeat that prayer. So we're going to be repeating it 3 times for each step. And as a reminder, if at any point it's not working, you're not able to access that feeling of care and compassion for someone, go back to step 1 and just offer it to yourself, because that's always where we start. So we're going to go ahead and begin, and I will guide you through each step of this prayer. But it helps to begin with just taking a few deep breaths, just settling into your body. And I find it helpful at the beginning of the prayer to picture yourself the way you imagine God sees you, as a beloved child, offering you tenderness and compassion. And start to allow God's unconditional love to fill you up. Allow yourself to feel that love, that tenderness. And then silently to yourself, start to repeat this prayer. May I feel God's love. May I feel God's peace. May I feel God's joy. May I feel God's love. May I feel God's peace. May I feel God's joy. May I feel God's love. May I feel God's peace. May I feel God's joy. Sit for a moment, soaking in that love and compassion. And when you feel ready, call to mind someone you care about, a family member, a friend, anyone who naturally brings up those feelings of love. And try to picture that person in your mind as if they're standing in front of you. and offer them this prayer. May they feel God's love. May they feel God's peace. May they feel God's joy. May they feel God's love. May they feel God's peace. May they feel God's joy. May they feel God's love. May they feel God's peace. May they feel God's joy. And next, think of someone neutral in your life, an acquaintance, someone you interact with regularly but maybe don't know very well. And picture that person as clearly as you can. And start to offer them God's love. May this person feel God's love. May this person feel God's peace. May this person feel God's joy. May they feel God's love. May they feel God's peace. May they feel God's joy. May they feel God's love. May they feel God's peace. May they feel God's joy. May they feel God's love and peace and joy. And now call to mind that difficult person. And remind yourself that this person too is a beloved child of God. And offer them the same blessing of God's love and peace and joy. May this difficult person feel God's love. May they feel God's peace. May they feel God's joy. May they feel God's love. May they feel God's peace. May they feel God's joy. May they feel God's love. May they feel God's peace. And may they feel God's joy. And finally, remember that God's love extends to all people. Picture the connections between people around the world. As you offer this prayer, may we all feel God's love. May we all feel God's peace. May we all feel God's joy. May all people feel God's love. May all people feel God's peace. May all people feel God's joy. May we all feel God's love. May we all feel God's peace. And may we all feel God's joy. Spend a moment checking in with yourself as this prayer comes to an end. Noticing how your heart and your mind and your body feel after tapping into God's love for you and for all people. And when you're ready, you can blink open your eyes, wiggle around a little bit. And if anyone would like to share any reflections or observations about that prayer experience, you are welcome to do so. What was it like to offer compassion to these different people in your life?
I find the whole experience very moving, I guess, if that makes sense. I'm usually not a person that can sit quietly. I talk a lot. But through all of these exercises, I mean, it's the second week, but even the first week and then this exercise too, like, it's very centering to kind of just take all of the noise and kind of just center it and really focus on what we're doing, which is powerful. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
To give up consequences, control, they practice that this helps.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I didn't get into the control aspect and how that relates to mental health. I think I'm trying to think which practices in the book that comes up for, but I think there is an aspect of saying, you know what? Solving this conflict is not my responsibility. I can lift it up to God, right? I can pray for this person, but I cannot control it. I cannot change them.
I was going to say, when I open my eyes, I think how noisy my mind is otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think,
You're both pointing out, when we think about meditation or like contemplative prayer, that centering prayer practice that I talked about in the first week, it can feel a little intimidating, right? This sort of unstructured, like I'm just supposed to sit and focus. And so these practices offer a structure for that time, right? They give us a way to kind of move through the time of prayer, that it doesn't just feel like I'm just supposed to sit here and think of what to say to God, right? There's a direction, there's a focus to it that can be really helpful. And distractions are part of the process. I always say that, right? It's totally normal. I was kind of loving the kids, laughing and playing next door, because I'm like, that's part of it, right? Can we love the distractions too, right? They're a part of the all people that we're praying for. So let them in. Don't feel like it's a bad thing when distractions interrupt our prayer. It's okay. It's all good. Jesus did say, "Let the children come to me." So try to.
This all focus, it just gave me a lightness of being all of that all together.
I had the sense that the person was actually feeling something that they visualized and sensing something.
Yeah, and it really can change our experience to think, like, what is it like for that person to be able to feel my care for them right now, and to feel God's care for both of us? And how does that change my experience in the moment, to know that they might be experiencing that?
I mentioned,
using this prayer as a tool, like in preparation for a difficult experience. If you know you're going to have to work with somebody difficult, it can be really helpful. It can also be helpful after a difficult experience to kind of recenter ourselves. And it can be helpful just as a everyday start your day, tap into God's love for you, right? Again, it's very flexible about how it can be used, how you can work it in. If you're having a really rough time, just stick with number one, right? Just keep tapping into God's love for you, and let that give you strength through whatever the difficulty is that you're facing. And then as you feel filled up, that cup naturally overflows and can start to share love to people around you as well. Other thoughts, comments, questions?
As I was praying for that person, I could kind of picture them on the receiving end of it and expecting that they will change completely. There's an expectation of that prayer. Not will it work, will it, if it's God's will, none of that. It's going to happen.
And often the mechanism of how it happens is because it changes us, right? So this difficult family member was easier to deal with because I had offered these blessings to her. And when we were in contact, she could tell that I was responding differently to her. And that changed how she, like, it does. It changes how we interact with people when they can tell that we're offering them compassion because it's changing us, right? So these practices do change the world because they change us. It's a both and.
Your eyes and picturing them in front of you. It's really powerful for me because I did change the words to you as if I was talking to you.
Well, thank you all. This has been a wonderful series. I'm kind of sad that it's coming to an end and I don't get to come back next week, but please come join me for the Faith and Science talk in Pennington next Sunday afternoon, or tune in from home. And you've got my contact information. I've got cards here if anybody wants to take them. Allison knows how to reach me. And I hope that, there can be ongoing conversation. I shared this last week, it's so exciting to hear all the ways that this congregation is engaging mental health and faith in these powerful ways. It's really cool to hear, so I hope I'll be able to stay in touch and hear how these things are kind of playing out. If you have questions about the practices or about some of the mental health research, feel free to reach out to me individually or grab me afterwards. I get really excited to nerd out about that stuff, so just be prepared. But thank you all. Yes.
So I really encourage take it. Don't worry about paying for it. Pay it later. It's such a wonderful resource, and for those of us who've been in the class, a reminder of what Miriam has covered. And then there are 3 more chapters.
Yeah, as we covered 6. There's 9 total.
Yeah. So mystery 3. Bonus.
All right. Well, thank you.
And owe you?
Yeah.
Do you have that?
No.
I'll owe you.
Great. For the book?
Yeah, I don't have money today. Can I bring money next week?
Yes, absolutely.
I'll try and find you here.
Okay.
Thank you, because I haven't really been here for most of this, but
It's such a great resource.
I know. I don't have the money right now, but
Okay.
I'll find you one day.
Okay.